Good day, everyone. Welcome to our very first International Holocaust Remembrance Day event, which will commemorate the victims of the horrific crimes committed by the Nazis and their supporters. This is a day for the world to educate itself about all issues related to the Holocaust and genocide. Ordinarily, we would have participated in events commemorating this day, but since most of us are still in shelter in place, we at ING thought it would be very valuable for our audiences to hold an event ourselves as it relates to Muslim-Jewish interfaith relations in the United States, which is very much part of our mission. I'm going to be the moderator today, and my name is Maha Elgenaidi. And I'm the founder of this organization, and I'm also now the Chief Innovation Officer for the organization. And with us today to teach us more about the Holocaust and have a conversation about Muslim-Jewish relations in the United States is Dr. Michael Berenbaum, who is the director of the Sigi Ziering Institute, which explores the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust at the American Jewish University, where he's also a professor of Jewish studies. He is the author and editor of 20 books, scores of scholarly articles, and hundreds of journalistic pieces, and is especially known for his work on the Holocaust. He has been a professor at several prestigious universities and served as deputy director of the President's Commission on the Holocaust. So welcome, Dr. Berenbaum. Thank you so much for being here with us. We're very honored to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and begin from the beginning by providing our audience first with a brief overview of the Holocaust, and try to include details that you know are often overlooked in this introductory conversation. And give us a mini history lesson of the Holocaust, if you will.
Okay. In one sense, there's a great story in Jewish tradition, which is a heathen came to two rabbis and said, "Tell me the whole Torah while I stand on one leg." The first rabbi threw him out, and the second rabbi said, "What is distasteful unto you, do not do unto your neighbor. The rest is commentary. Go study it."
Mm-hmm.
So when you asked me to give you a brief overview of the Holocaust, let me say that we could go on for that for a week, but we'll try to do it very briefly.
In 5 minutes or less, if you can.
The Nazis came to power in 1933 as part of the coalition government.
Mm-hmm.
They came to power with two agendas on their mind. One was the expansion of Germany itself to ultimately as far as the Ukraine, in order to provide food for it, the breadbasket of Europe, in order to provide food for its population. The second was a racial agenda in which they saw themselves as the master race. They saw a whole series of races as inferior to the Germans, and then they saw the Jews as not only inferior but cancerous, who had to be gotten rid of. Initially, they thought of getting rid of Jews as elimination by expulsion. If you make it impossible for Jews to live as Jews in Germany, they will leave. And later on, we'll see how that policy developed. So once they came to power, they did two things, which is they consolidated power to eliminate all other parties.
Mm-hmm.
They then developed something called the Führerprinzip, which is after August 1934, when President von Hindenburg died, Adolf Hitler became the president and chancellor of Germany, and ultimately he ruled by martial law, and his word itself had the force of law. It was called the Führer's Principle.
Mm-hmm.
They then went in a series of discriminatory measures against diverse elements of the population. Some were victimized for what they did: trade unionists, political dissidents, social democrats. Some for what they refused to do. Jehovah's Witnesses would not swear allegiance to the state.
Mm-hmm.
They would not register for the draft.
Mm-hmm.
Germans went after German male homosexuals because they were an embarrassment to the notion of the virility of the German male. They went after Roma and Sinti, who were gypsies whom they regarded as asocial. And they went after those who were, I'm using non-PC term, let's say those with special needs, but they define mentally retarded, physically handicapped, emotionally distraught, and the like. And then they engaged in a series of persecution of Jews in such a way that forced the Jews to leave. The problem with forcing the Jews to leave was twofold. One, no country was willing to receive Jews in the numbers to which they had to leave. An experience, for example, familiar in the world today, the question of the displacement, for example, of Syrian refugees. And secondly, the German Reich expanded, and each time it expanded, it included more and more and more Jews. So in 1938, Germany, between 1933 and 38, had 150,000 Jews emigrate. In March 1938, it entered into Austria when something called the Anschluss. 200,000 Jews became then immediately part of Austria, so they had a net gain of 50,000. When they went into the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, they gained another 90,000 Jews. And later on, when they invaded Poland, and Poland was divided between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, when they went into Poland, they gained 2 million Jews, and that made the problem overwhelming. And nobody was willing, and nobody could imagine that they would receive 2 million Jews. Consequently, something else happened. Germany kept expanding. They went into France, they went into Belgium, they went into Luxembourg, they went into Denmark. They kept expanding. They went into Norway. Each time they expanded, they gained a larger and larger Jewish community. Ultimately, they went into Greece and Yugoslavia. And once again, the Jewish community expanded wider. The Jews under their control expanded wider and wider. In June 1941, the Germans then invaded. I'm using Germans, not Nazis, because invasion is an act of state, an act of an army. The Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and that's the moment at which what we call the Holocaust, what the Germans called the final solution to the Jewish problem, began as a program of what the Germans called extermination. But we should call annihilation, because we don't exterminate human beings. We exterminate venom and the like. And then the story of the Holocaust can be seen very simply. The Germans sent in 3,000 troops called Einsatzgruppen and special troops. They were assisted by local anti-Semites, by gendarmerie, by native nationalist populations, by neighbors, and also by the occupying armies. And they shot Jews town by town, village by village, hamlet by hamlet, men, women, and children.
In every country. In every
area of the occupied Soviet Union.
Okay, in the
So
Soviet
one example, 33,771 Jews from Kiev were killed on September 27th, September 28th, 1941. This killing continued for the better part of 2 years. It had one round and then two rounds as they went back to get the rest of the population. And that was problematic for killing, not for the victims, but for two groups. It was problematic for the perpetrators themselves. It apparently is not easy to get up every morning and shoot men, women, and especially children. There were mental breakdowns. There was need for alcohol afterwards, then gradually alcohol before and during. And also it was occurring in full view of the local population. And consequently, the population said if they went after them, they're going to go after us. And the Germans then had unease. So the next area is a reversal of the process. If at first you sent mobile killers to stationary victims, the reversal of that process is to make the victims mobile and the killing centers no longer individuals, but an assembly line factory. The killing centers mobile. The killing centers stationary. Mobile victims, stationary killers. Let's make it vivid to you. The reason Auschwitz became Auschwitz is it had 44 parallel railroad tracks.
Had how many? I'm sorry.
44 parallel railroad tracks. New York's Penn Station only has 21. New York's Penn Station can have 750,000 people on a busy holiday weekend. So Auschwitz became Auschwitz. Now, what is the death camp, which is the unique apparatus of the Nazis, is an assembly line where people are brought in. They then, in certain camps, there was no differentiation between the entire population. They were sent immediately to gas chambers. In a place like Auschwitz, there was what we call selection, in which they divided. You arrived in Auschwitz, you were separated into 5 men and women, stood in a line of 5, and a Nazi doctor made a decision: will you live, will you die, based on your appearance. Those who died who were to be killed immediately were sent off to the gas chambers. This time they were complete with crematoria, even an elevator and a dissecting table, because they wanted to take anything valuable from the human being. And those who could work for a while were worked until they no longer could work. And then they were selected again and faced death. So this became, in essence, a movement from mobile killers and stationary victims to stationary killing centers, which were assembly lines based on the principle of Henry Ford's assembly line and Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest, which brought about the annihilation of Jews and the annihilation of gypsies when certain countries were victimized as Jews. At the end, there were close to 6 million Jews who were murdered, probably in the neighborhood of 3 million in concentration camps, in what we call death camps, and several million by mobile killers, and the rest who died in ghettos and the like, and we haven't gone into that. Now, let me conclude in this brief time by saying this encompassed the whole of Europe. 22 different countries. It evolved over 12 years, and it had implications because, in one sense, Hitler said what he was going to do, and then he did what he said. And and Germany was the most culturally advanced, the most
democratic of society,
the most civilized societies. No, Hitler destroyed the democracy
in Germany.
If we began by going back, if you gave me a long time, I could talk about the polarization, the economic dislocation, and all of the things that allowed an authoritarian figure to rise, and how authoritarian figure became a totalitarian figure and became an absolute dictator. That's the story of the evolution from 1919 to 1933, which ironically has vast implications for the world today as we see the rise of authoritarian figures. Let me give you one final example. Hitler and Franklin Delano Roosevelt came to power exactly 28 and 4, 33 days apart in 1933. Hitler on January 30th, Roosevelt on March 4th, which was then the inauguration day. Hitler turned the population one against another. Roosevelt turned the population one toward another. One healed his nation, included all within the situation. The other ultimately shattered and destroyed his nation. And they died again. Roosevelt died on April 12th, 1945. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, So they died 18 days apart.
Thank you. So when
Rest is commentary, go study.
Yeah. So when we're talking about the Holocaust, we're not just talking about the people that are rounded up and perish in these concentration camps. We're also talking about the persecution that Jews experience in the lands that Germany occupied. So it wasn't
not only in the lands that Germany occupied, but also in the lands that became allied with Germany.
That became
in other words, in countries that were allied with Germany, for example, in Romania, in Hungary.
Were not occupied, but they were allied with the.
They were allied. Hungary was later occupied because it wasn't doing a fast enough job on the annihilation of the Jews.
So there were concentration camps also outside of Germany.
The killing centers were in German-occupied Poland.
Okay.
We always have to be careful not to say in Poland, because they weren't Polish camps, they were German camps, Nazi camps in German-occupied Poland.
Okay.
There were camps in France. There were, in essence, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has now identified 43,000 different types of camps. Meaning they dotted the entire map of Europe. 6 of them were killing centers, which had a vast, whose job was to kill the population upon arrival.
And what was the period of time again, if you could just remind us the period of time that all of this took place?
The murders by systematic murder began on June 22nd, 1941, and continued through the end of the war, May 8th, 1945.
45.
Persecution. So it's 4 years. Persecution of Jews began in 1933 and endured to the last day. Hitler told us as early as 1919 what he wanted to achieve, and his last will and testament, the last line of his last will and testament is to beseech the German people to continue the task of murdering the Jews.
And people outside of Germany, people that were not occupied by Germany or were allied with Germany, like the United States, for example, Canada, Australia, they knew this was happening?
Historians make a very interesting distinction between knowledge and information. They had vast amount of information. And by the way, one of the great sources of information was the Vatican. Because remember, the Vatican had priests in every country. Priests cannot tell you the details of what they hear in confession.
Including Poland, right? Poland's
heavily Roman Catholic.
Yeah, Catholic.
Poland. Priests cannot tell you what they hear in confession about specifics, but they can tell you the general impression of what the situation is. They reported to a neutral apostolic delegate or papal nuncio. And therefore, the information coming into the Vatican was very important. The victims tried to get word out. There was a friend of mine who was a colleague at Georgetown for many years, Jan Karski, who brought out direct information, a direct plea, visited the ghettos, visited a transit camp in order to bear witness. And consequently, the Allies had vast amount of information. When it became knowledge for people, and that happened individually, and for governments, that's the moment in which they said, what can we do? And in the words of one scholar, the pessimists won, they said nothing could be done. The optimists weren't even given the hearing. Because the optimists said we had to try something daring. The great symbol of that is why didn't we bomb the killing center at Auschwitz or the tracks leading to Auschwitz? We did bomb 5 kilometers from Auschwitz at the slave labor camp called Bunamanovitz or Auschwitz III. But there are thousands of examples of when people who could have known, should have known, might have known, didn't do anything. But remember, some people pretend not to know. and language obscures.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to face the reality of knowing the real situation.
Right. So I'm almost afraid to ask the question, but I'm going to. Muslim majority countries or Muslim majority regions, of course, the Ottoman Empire had just fallen, and now we have the creation of the nation states throughout the Arabian Peninsula. What was their role in all of this? What was?
Let's begin by saying,
Mm-hmm.
this was really a Christian-Jewish conflict
Mm-hmm.
that had little manifestation in Muslim nations.
Mm-hmm.
They were and the Jews were better off in Muslim nations than they were. The only that's not to say all Muslims were innocent,
Mm-hmm.
because the Mufti of Jerusalem met with Hitler, was
Mm-hmm.
used as part of Nazi propaganda, and inspired a pogrom in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, Iran became a way station which was rescuing Jews,
Mm-hmm.
allowing them to go forth to Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
Jews in Vichy France were in worse shape than Jews in French colonial North Africa.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So Vichy was a collaborationist government.
Mm-hmm.
The king of Morocco wouldn't allow the deportation of his Jews,
Mm-hmm.
and consequently the Jews were in better shape in North Africa than under King Mohammed than they were in Vichy France.
Mm-hmm.
And it depended in Algeria and in Libya who exactly was the occupying power. I did a film years ago about the role that Turkey played in saving its own Jews,
Mm-hmm.
and also in doing something very interesting. In the early years of persecution, it recruited Jewish faculty from German universities,
Mm-hmm.
Jewish lawyers to reshape the Turkish legal system, Jewish architects to reshape buildings,
Mm-hmm.
Jewish musicians to shape and bring Western music,
Mm-hmm.
and Jewish doctors to shape medicine. So
Mm-hmm.
it recruited those who were destroyed and denied and persecuted in Germany were recruited in Turkey
Mm-hmm.
to save them
Mm-hmm.
and to contribute to society.
Mm-hmm.
So they joked about the university in Istanbul. They said it was the best German university outside of Germany.
So I've always heard about this imam in Jerusalem who, allegedly worked with Hitler as someone who wasn't mentally stable, or who was just a sort of a crazy person. That's the narrative that I think a lot of Muslims who hear this story have about him. Is that not true?
I think let me add a couple of things before I answer that.
Mm-hmm.
There were certain countries where Muslims rescued Jews.
Mm-hmm.
There is the Turkish ambassador in the Turkish consul general in Greece, in Rhodes,
Mm-hmm.
rescued Jews, rescued a series of Jews, and he was honored by Yad Vashem as the righteous among the nations of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
His name was Ulkaman.
Mm-hmm.
His wife and his child were murdered.
Mm.
He was not.
By the Nazis.
Albania, which is a primarily Muslim country,
That's right. Yeah.
was the one country in the world in Europe, that had more Jews at the end than it did at the beginning.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Because under the commitment of BESA,
Mm-hmm.
the ESA, it rescued its Jews.
Mm-hmm.
The Mufti played a pernicious role.
Mm-hmm.
Mufti was against Jewish settlement in Palestine,
Mm-hmm.
and saw the attack against the Jews as fortifying his position in opposition to Jewish settlement in Palestine, and met with Hitler and was used as a propaganda element by Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're saying crazy, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't judge, but I would say in a serious way,
Mhm.
crazy like a fox.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, it's the Muslim perspective on that story. But thank you for sharing that. So I'm gonna just in the interest of time, I'm gonna jump to our next questions about Muslims and what we can do with the story of the Holocaust. So, like other religious communities, we have our own private Islamic education institutions that range from K through 12 full-time day schools to adult education in the mosques. What is at stake in teaching responsibly about the Holocaust? What does that involve?
Let me begin by saying that
Mhm,
if you ask me what we have to do in religious institutions,
mhm,
is we have to remind everybody
mhm.
that all human beings are God's creation.
Amen.
The one thing that we all share in common is that we are created in the divine image,
Mhm,
and all human beings are in God's image.
mhm,
And even though we live by the truths of our own faith, and I certainly live by the truths of my faith, the
mhm,
truth of my faith does not mean that. I'll tell it to you in a story which will make some theological sense to you. I had a student who was a great African American entertainer by the name of Pearl Bailey, and she'd gotten an honorary doctorate at Georgetown and decided then to get a real college education. Took 3 classes with me, did her senior thesis with me,
mhm,
and I was asked to speak at her funeral,
mhm,
which was held in a black church that had once been her father's church.
mhm,
Um, the man who got up before me said, I didn't know Pearl Bailey, but Pearl Bailey knew Jesus, went on to 20 minutes about Jesus. And I was then supposed to be the next speaker.
mhm,
I'm a Jew, I'm a rabbi. What's going to happen
mhm,
after he said that?
mhm,
And the man who introduced me did something exceedingly wise, which is theologically noble. He said, I knew Pearl Bailey, and let me tell you what I learned about Pearl Bailey. There are many rooms in God's mansion,
mhm,
many windows and many doors.
mhm.
And Pearl Bailey liked to try out the many rooms. And if the door wasn't open, she peeked in the window, the like. So I believe very firmly that in the fact that there are multiple ways to God,
Mhm,
and that the most important thing for all of us to recognize is
mhm,
the humanity of all of God's creation,
mhm,
from the least of us to the most exalted of us,
mhm,
Jews, Christians, Muslims, Asians, whatever religions, multiple paths, multiple ways.
mhm,
Your having a truth that you live by doesn't interfere with the truths that I live.
mhm,
But
mhm,
there are, if the world is as diverse as it is,
mhm,
and you believe in God, you must also believe that God somehow wants diversity,
mhm,
and we know that out of diversity can come harmony, or out of diversity can come clashes.
mhm,
And our
mhm,
job in this generation is to see if we can minimize the clashes and
mhm,
maximize the harmony.
mhm. Nothing that you said. I didn't know that you were a rabbi, and now that I know that you are, I'm going to call you Rabbi Berenbaum. But nothing that you said it disagrees with Islamic teachings about diversity. That it's part of God's divine will, and going against it is going against the will, going against the will of God. But politics always interferes, and so. If we want Muslim, Jewish, Muslim day schools, rather, and adult education in mosques to teach about the Holocaust, what resources would you recommend for them? Is there
Well,
anything that is good for people to read or
yeah,
to make a book club
let me
around?
begin by saying I always believe that history must be read also along with biography or memoir.
Hmm.
And the reason for that is because I'm going to quote Stalin on this: death of millions of people is a statistic,
Hmm.
one person is a story.
Right. Hmm.
And if you see the impact of the Holocaust personified in the life of one person, you identify with that. That's why Elie Wiesel's Night is so powerful. It's why the Diary of Anne Frank so resonates.
Okay.
The idea is that we have to understand that this didn't happen in the abstract. It's not statistics. It happened to people,
Right.
to people like you and like me.
Mhm.
There are also a couple of important treatments of Muslims during the Holocaust.
Right.
There's a book. There's a book by a fellow by the name of Rod Satloff, who ironically is a scholar in the Middle East, but whose wife was a diplomat in Morocco, and he wrote about a righteous hero. I did a film years ago called Desperate Hours on Turkey and the Holocaust. There's material on Bessa.
Is that available? Is that available online?
That should be available online.
Okay.
And there is valuable material that is available, which I think you should know the general history. And in addition to knowing the general history, Muslims can find Muslims with whom they can identify. One of our audience, Bob Frankel, reminds us that Facing History and Ourselves has a wonderful curriculum relating to the Holocaust.
I was just going to mention them, yeah, for schools.
And they are terrific. You worked with Jack Weinstein.
Yeah,
There's nobody better than Jack Weinstein. And Facing History is quite terrific in what they do.
It's actually quite terrific for full-time Islamic schools. I never thought about that. Thank you so much. Moving along, when addressing or teaching about the persecution of other people, like, for example, the Uyghurs in China, the Rohingya in Myanmar, people have made comparisons to the Holocaust. And my question to you is it ever appropriate? And when is it not appropriate to sort of make them?
Let's go with a very simple thing. Most people confuse comparison with equivalence.
Okay.
Whenever you compare and you contrast. Because there is something unique and distinct about each event. So when we use the word Holocaust now in general culture, it's a way of shouting, it's a way of screaming, calling attention to what you do. That invites misuse historically. But when we really explore an event, then we understand where it parallels and where it differs.
Okay.
And I think, and in fact, there was a scholar by the name of Greg Stanton, Professor Gregory Stanton, who said there are 10 stages to genocide.
Right.
Among the stages, genocide or persecution,
right,
discrimination, symbolization. In other words, how do you symbolize people whom are your enemies? So in Cambodia, the symbol was somebody who wore glasses or who wore a certain scarf, who read. In the Holocaust, it was the Jewish star. There also ended up being annihilation,
right,
what was called extermination. And then the final element of genocide was also denial. The killers always deny they were committing genocide. Germany is a little bit of an exception because Germany admitted what it did and did what it admitted, but it obscured from itself while doing it. By language, it obscured what it was doing. So it called something the final solution. It spoke about resettlement in the East. It did all sorts of things to deceive themselves from what was happening. But Holocaust denial set in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And Holocaust denial, Holocaust denial is ironic because the Holocaust is the most widely documented genocide in human history. Germans kept record, the Jews kept record, the records are in 25 different countries all over the globe. And consequently, to deny it is to be part of what we would call the Flat Earth Society. How can you deny the earth? How can you deny that the earth is round after after you've been to outer space and the like?
Right.
So I wrote a book once called "The Known, the Unknown, the Disputed, and the Re-Examined." You can have many different ways of saying what you don't yet know, but that's different than Holocaust denial. And we have a more pernicious thing that took place on January 6th in America, where you even had two elements. You had a fellow who was proud, Auschwitz, and on the back staff. So he wanted to re-perpetrate the Holocaust. And you have a symbol that was used called 6MWE. 6 million wasn't enough, so let's continue the Holocaust. And let's be frank. If I were to have spoken to President Ahmadinejad, former President Ahmadinejad of Iran, I would have said you're in a paradox. Germany admits it did something. You are trying to deny that Germany committed genocide. What the hell do you know about German history? And why don't you know your own history, which is a noble history of rescue and saving?
Oh, amen. Yeah.
And I never understood the logic of it, because he could have said, look at the West. You committed a massive genocide on a large scale. Lots of countries were involved. All of Europe was engaged. The United States had the capacity to do things that it did not do. Instead, he got into an area he knew nothing about, which diminished his respect in the world, made him a laughingstock, and didn't even know the noble history of his own people.
Right. Well, it served a narrative that was anti-Israel. I don't think that he was thinking along the same lines that you were.
No, I'm just saying, clearly he had a different goal.
But it served a political narrative.
And he wasn't a historian.
No, ING and I think several other Muslim American organizations were quick to condemn some of the things that he said about this issue, because he was also speaking unfortunately as a Muslim, representing Islam in his comments. So believe it or not, we're almost 10 after the hour. So this is such a wonderful conversation. I'm actually hoping and praying to God that more Muslim American organizations continue to have this conversation internally and with people such as yourself. So before we close, I just want to turn our attention to issues confronting both Muslims and Jews in the United States. And as we know, in the current political environment, with the rise of open white supremacy and white nationalism, Jews and Muslims find themselves both facing bigotry and hate crimes. In fact, as you may know already, I know that you've been on from webinar to the next, but in just a few hours ago, the DHS acting secretary issued a National Domestic Terrorism Advisory Bulletin warning of possible terror attacks in relation to the presidential transition. And in the detail of the bulletin that I read earlier, they address possible causes of previous domestic terrorism as being longstanding racial and ethnic tension, including opposition to immigration. So while I don't want to alarm anyone that's listening to us, this bulletin was not specific on any immediate threats, but Muslims and Jews have reasons to be on alert, quite frankly. Why? Because we know that white nationalist groups often blame Jews for immigration. And unlike white supremacy, white nationalism is rooted in the anti-Semitic belief that Jews are responsible for the defeat of white supremacy. And they say that the Jews seek to destroy the white race through mass immigration and a host of inclusionary policies, according to experts like Eric Ward, who studies white nationalist groups. Now, Islamophobia intersects with this in that Muslims are often viewed as the immigrants, which Jews are helping to settle in the United States. So they exploit pervasive fears that many Americans have of Islam and Muslims by also targeting Muslims. So Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are directly linked in how they feed into each other by hate groups. They're joined by the hip, so to speak, and this of course leads to hate crimes against both communities. In fact, recent polls by a very prominent research group found that 60% of Muslims and 58% of Jews report experiencing religious-based discrimination. I can tell you about my own.
We also deal with one very important thing in our climate, which is that Jews especially experienced a very short window in which if you were anti-Semitic, you were embarrassed to express it.
Yeah.
And what we have now is we have the permissibility of the expression of hatred. And regarding such permissibility, such expression of hatred, as a sign of authenticity. As a sign of authenticity. So all of these anti-Semitic, racial, anti-Muslim things occur in a climate that has allowed for much greater hatred.
Yeah.
And a climate in which you have polarization and division. And the tragedy of this moment, the most important part of the tragedy of this moment, is given the nature of the health crisis and the economic crisis, we are all in this together.
Right.
My wearing a mask protects your life. Your wearing a mask protects mine. If I get a vaccine, it protects me and you. If you get a vaccine, it protects you and me. Unless we get through the health crisis, we can't get through the economic crisis. And the irony of it is that nobody is immune from this. Presidents and prime ministers have gotten COVID, and the rich have gotten COVID. The princes in England have gotten COVID. So we are all in this together, and the most elemental of all values is that we are responsible for one another.
Amen. But I want you to, I know that we have a few minutes left with you. I want you to come back to specifically what Jews and Muslims could be doing together in the United States.
First of all, we should know
counter anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, which seem to be joined at the hip here. They're both feeding into each other because of the rise in white supremacy and white nationalism. Can you just
First of all, first thing is we should not know each other as strangers.
Yep.
And that is that we should be in dialogue with each other. We should be candid about our differences, but also very candid about our collective history together. One of the very important things is that some of the greatest Jewish religious thinkers flourished in the societies that had Jewish, Christian, and Muslim dialogue. This protected during the Middle Ages. This gave rise to a whole range of Jewish thinkers, all of whom wrote in Arabic and created for themselves a Judeo-Arabic that gave rise to some of the greatest parts of our literature. This was an Islam that was proud instead of in a protective mode.
Much more confident.
And confident. And it was the height of the influence of Islamic culture. And the Jews themselves benefited from that and participated in it. And were part and parcel of this dialogue. If I study medieval Jewish philosophy, I have to study medieval Islamic philosophy because they were writing with each other as audiences and with each other's writings in mind. And remember, Judaism and Islam both preserve the Greek classics for Western civilization. Aristotle and Plato would not have come down to the West without the work of Islamic and Jewish philosophers. And we can give many other examples. The other thing I stress to Jewish audiences is that Islam had a way of accepting, and we have to build on that way of accepting Jews. Islam called Jews people of the book, and consequently Jews at any point in Jewish history, with the exception of the past 60 years, if I had to live under Muslim domination or Christian domination, I would have preferred to live under no domination. But if I had to live under the domination of one rather than the other, I would have preferred Muslim domination because there I was protected and my rights were respected.
Wow, that's a huge testament. And of course, Jews are still considered Ahl Kitab, people of the book, and it's because it's in our scriptures, primary and secondary scriptures. What would you say to people that still define Muslims and Jews in America that still define their relationship by where you stand on Israel, and most recently where you stand on BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement? I don't want you to comment on Israel or BDS, but what would you say to people that still define themselves by that?
I would say, if you can't come to agreement, talk about something else. And the other thing is, it's very important for both groups. It's very important for Muslims to understand why Jews are committed to Israel, but they should also understand that in Israel, the position of the government of Israel is Israel has had a divided government, a divided population. And many American Jews who feel a love and a passion and a deep commitment to Israel does not mean that they support the policies of this or that Israeli government.
Right.
There's a much more diversity, and I think if we explored it, we could come to conclusions that narrow the distance between us. And I think that that's a very important thing to do. And Israel should not be a taboo subject, but more importantly, it shouldn't be the only subject.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we stress at ING is, let's begin by seeing each other first as human beings, meeting, breaking bread, learning about each other. And we've developed programs around that, the Interfaith Speakers Bureau, the Holocaust Seder, where we come together, study together, learn about each other, and break bread, and then have the conversation. And I think the conversation then is going to be a lot more thoughtful when it does happen. So we're almost at the end time. I know that you have to run to another webinar. I want to have Ishaq Patan, our Bay Area director, come back on. And just, if there's one question that sums up the other questions of the people that were on the webinar, that are in the webinar, if you could just ask that one question, Ishaq, what would that be? Because I know that we have to end in a few minutes.
Hello, everyone. Ishaq from ING. I'm the Bay Area director. We actually have not had any major questions. So I think we can go ahead and wrap up on time.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, final comments or words from you.
Let's do that. Look, my final comment is let's do it again.
Let's do it again. Exactly. I think we need longer time, and so let me go ahead and close by thanking you.
The best. I'll put it to you in a very clean joke. The best compliment you can pay to a chef is a four-letter word. More.
Is a what?
Is a four-letter word. More.
More.
What's the highest compliment you can pay to a chef? More. So thank you. Let's do more.
Thank you, and thank you for being our teacher today on this important topic. And I want to thank everyone who joined us for your participation. I'm sorry that we didn't have more time to have a sort of a dialogue with you, but I think it's clear from watching the news and what you heard today on the webinar that we face a surge in all forms of racism and bigotry, and specifically of white nationalism, which has anti-Semitism as its core and Islamophobia as an essential component to that. So all the communities targeted by white nationalism need to fight to uproot anti-Semitism, and in particular, fighting anti-Semitism in particular, as they fight to uproot all forms of bigotry.
Thank you.
And I just want to say one more thing before you go, and it should also be clear that wrestling with the horror of the Holocaust is essential to combating anti-Semitism, and Muslim majority nations, especially, and Muslim communities targeted by Islamophobia, need to understand and act on teaching about the Holocaust and ensuring that such horror is never again perpetrated against anyone. And I thank you again, Dr. Berenbaum, for helping us understand this need. And I hope that we all go back to our homes and communities determined to bring the message of the importance of teaching about the Holocaust to them. So with that, we will close. And I know that he's already left. And so, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.